see two empty chairs. We've not scared folks away. We are super grateful for every one of these officials giving us their time, but recognize there's a small detail happening in 40-some days. So there are conference calls and Zoom meetings happening, and you might see some folks as the afternoon goes on going in and out. But we look forward to plunging into a completely new but interrelated topic, and we will save room for questions. Ben or Bob, why don't you kind of cue up the topic?
This next session is what happens in the voting place, how votes are tabulated, what happens in the polling place, the way things are set up, and all the safeguards to ensure the vote. So to start things off, we'd like to talk about voting system technology and the safeguards in that. Of course, challenges to the accuracy of voting machines has come up frequently in debates and in past litigation. But there are a series of tests that are done on voting machines to ensure their accuracy both before the election and after the election. So, Lisa, let me turn to you as both a former county official and a current statewide official to talk a little bit about those checks.
Thank you for the question. So we talked about a little bit earlier, Arizona is not a top-down state. Counties run elections. But one of the unique things about Arizona is we do logic and accuracy testing on election equipment when there are state and federal candidates. So we have 15 counties, roughly 1,700 precincts possible. We test anywhere from 200 to 250 of those precincts. We test every legislative district, every congressional district, and we take pre-marked test decks to the counties physically and test their accessible voting devices, their tabulation equipment. They have no idea how many ballots we bring, roughly 200 up to 2,000. In the primary election, we tested over 12,000 ballots in 15 counties. So they have no idea what the results are. It's all random. They run the test. I have a sealed envelope with all the election results in it. They run the tabulators. We compare the results, and guess what? 100% accuracy. We were one vote off, and after researching it, it turned out to be human error in an adjudication. Sometimes there's a human error on the Secretary of State's part because they're marking 12,000 test ballots with a predetermined amount and make a mistake. So that, coupled with all the other chain of custody and audit trails we do, we talked a little bit earlier about other issues, how we know the results are the results and how we know dead people aren't voting. Well, we also compare the total ballots cast in an election to the total number of voters who got credit for that election, because only one vote counts. So that's some of the stuff we do in Arizona for logic and accuracy testing.
We turn to the state level, if I could. Jeff, how do you handle it in Allegheny County to test out your machines?
It's very similar to Arizona. First of all, we don't purchase any machines that aren't thoroughly tested at the state level and the federal level. So once they are certified at both levels, that's when we, went shopping for a new voting system. And we do the exact thing. Actually, they're preparing it right now without me. But next Tuesday, we will do a predetermined test deck, like Arizona mentioned. That's open to various groups to watch the process. We have 1,327 precincts in Allegheny County, and so each one has a scanner, and we will run that test deck through each and every machine. We will also test our central scanners. We have 10 of those. We run a test deck through that. We run a test deck through all 1,327 machines and tabulate it, and then run it through our system. We know what the results are supposed to be because it's predetermined and they're marked in that way. We do find once in a while one is off. It should have had 8 votes, now it has 7. And every time I've ever been involved, it's been a human error where you go back to the machine and there's that one ballot laying on top of the machine that somebody didn't put through. We've never had any mechanical tabulation errors. And so once we do these tests, then it triggers our mail-in ballots to be sent out, and we start preparing the machines to be delivered.
And don't you find that it's probably the same in every state here? I, as an election official, nobody likes a test. We can call it a quiz. That doesn't make it any less scary. But I was never concerned that the machines were going to have different results. You know why? Because I tested thousands and thousands of ballots before the state came to test. And so I know counties are still doing that. And then we also have to do post-election logic and accuracy testing with those same decks.
So
very similar in Pennsylvania.
Wisconsin and Michigan have particular challenges because you have so many jurisdictions. 1,900 with Wisconsin, 1,500 plus with Michigan. So tell us a little bit how, both from the state and county level, you all test your machines.
So I can start with the state level. So at the state level, our commission, so we have a bipartisan commission, they meet in public, they're charged with certifying at the state level our voting equipment. So once something has been certified at the federal level, then if a local official is interested in it, then that vendor can come in and ask for certification at the state level. And then the commission meets in a public meeting and decides whether or not it meets our statutory standards. As part of that, we have to test the equipment. So we'll go out to 3 different counties and we'll do all sorts of tests. We'll have thousands of test ballots that we run through to provide data to the commission about the operability of that system. Then, once a system's certified and is in use in a local jurisdiction, there's a couple of different checks on the process. First is before each election, in the 10 days before the election, each of our municipalities, so all 1,850 city, town, and villages, have to test all of their voting equipment in public. And so you can go watch this in any community. People rarely show up, and I'll let Lisa and Kim speak to that, but it's something we've been working to publicize even more, show people this is a great opportunity. Come see how the equipment works, come be a part of it, but people rarely show up to those opportunities. Then after the election, after a general election, the commission again meets to talk about the post-election audit. And the post-election audit is looking at the paper ballots, basically doing a hand count and verifying that the hand count is the same as the tally on the electronic tabulating equipment. And when I first started, the commission mandated that 2% of all the ballots cast be reviewed as part of the audit. We're now up to over 10%, and they have a whole formula for going through to make sure that every county is represented, as well as each type of voting equipment is represented. We're about to have our public meeting of the commission on October 4th, where they'll decide the parameters for the audit for this year. And I expect that one of the things that they'll consider, in addition to an audit on the machine tabulated ballots, is an audit on the hand-counted ballots. Because in some of our small towns, they actually can hand count by state statute. And so I think that's something they'll consider, is whether or not we want to do additional audits and checks on those hand count jurisdictions.
Actually do the programming for our county. We actually, when I do that, we actually do a full county test of everything at our level before we send it out to our municipalities. And then our municipalities, as Megan said, they have to publicly notice it and publish and test everything 10 days before the election. After the election, a number of county clerks actually will do audits at every single election. And I do those audits, and I've done them since 2018, and they've been 100% accurate. We have one county clerk I know of that does the hand count audit also, and their machines are 100% accurate, but they found issues in the hand counts. I trust those machines.
Yeah, I think Michigan's very similar. Obviously, we have the
I'll
same.
start.
Oh, I'm
Just-
sorry.
It's okay. All good, and then I'll pass it back to you. So for voting equipment in Michigan, before any voting system is used in Michigan, it's tested. Let me bring this over. It is tested by a lab approved by the Election Assistance Commission, the EAC, and approved by our bipartisan state board of canvassers. There are 3 companies that manufacture voting machines in Michigan: Hart, ESSS, and Dominion. 7 counties have, and each county clerk can choose which of the 3, or did choose which of the 3 companies to select for the county's machinery. 7 counties selected ES&S, 11 selected Hart, and the remaining counties selected Dominion. I know Ottawa uses Hart, Kent, you use Dominion, and we at the state level work with all 3 vendors to make sure tech support is available to all of the counties and local clerks that need it. In addition to that, voting equipment is securely stored between elections, and before each election, all equipment undergoes logic and accuracy testing, much like Wisconsin and other states publicly as well, using test ballots to make sure they're working correctly. And Justin, I know you'll talk more about that. The other thing I'll just emphasize, because I know this is an issue, in Michigan, tabulators are never connected to the internet during voting. We would encourage and welcome your assistance in helping to make that clear to folks in your readership and all across the country. After Election Day, clerks use a variety of methods to transmit unofficial results from the local level to the county level, and then outwards to the state, and again, really underscores the layers of our security and partnerships in our state.
Yeah, I don't think I have a whole lot to add to that, other than the fact that, in addition to, the importance of the decentralization here is really critical as well. And Michigan is similar to Wisconsin in the fact that at the county level, that's the entity responsible for the programming of election equipment. And so we do rigorous testing in-house prior to ever printing ballots. So before we're printing hundreds of thousands of ballots, we're also testing every aspect of the equipment to ensure that it counts what it's supposed to count. It doesn't count what it's not supposed to count. Michigan has an open-closed primary system, and so we don't allow the crossover voting. It's one ballot, but different party columns. There's certain rules that have to be tested in that process, and they are. And I think the other thing I would add is, this is a very public process, and we invite people to join us in that process. We started doing Facebook Live and social media filming events during COVID where, essentially it was difficult for people to actually attend these things. And so we make it exciting. This is fun, guys, right? This is a part of our process that is really important to have that public oversight. And so it's interesting because in the past couple of election cycles, we've seen more individuals come in and participate and watch that process. But I think it's a really integral part, along with the post-election audit, which is also public, where we're hand count verifying, in addition to 76 other points of interest that we are checking in a post-election audit. We're also doing a hand count verification.
Certainly. I won't get into our post-election processes yet, but we are pretty extensive in our pre-election processes around voting systems. North Carolina is a state that not only adheres to the federal voluntary voting system guidelines through the EAC, we also have our own state certification program. And that dates back to statewide certification in 2006. So there is certified voting equipment in all of our polling places, and it must meet state certification in order for a county to procure that. And we ensure that the right equipment is delivered by conducting acceptance testing upon delivery. That's just to be a certified system in North Carolina. Those vendors must also post a bond that covers the cost of a statewide election if that system were to have failure and cause a new election to be called. Right now, that's a $17 million bond. And we will survey after this election to determine if the cost is even greater, which I would say that is the case. They also must keep their software in escrow. And there are provisions within our laws where that escrow can be, source code can be reviewed. We also have certified ballot printers that have to meet state standards and standards of the warranty of those voting systems. So that's even pre-election steps that we take. Once we're into the election, since 2006, we've had a uniform logic and accuracy testing program for all counties that must be conducted before any machines are deployed. This includes testing every contest, every position, and a unique vote count. It's not just everyone gets one and call that good. We make sure that the whole system is working all the way up to testing our aggregation results system in a mock election. Furthermore, we The logic and accuracy testing is a public event. We do notice that as well, as has been stated. And bipartisan officials or county election officials are the ones conducting that logic and accuracy testing.
Absolutely, and thank you. One thing that I don't think's been said yet that I think is important to note is when we go through this type of pre-election testing, we're not just trying to see if anything's wrong with the system. We don't like surprises. And on election day, we want to know that that thing's going to turn on, the battery's going to work, the kind of paper we're using is going to work in the system. We just got some new paper in Georgia we're going through LNA with that right now. But before any of that, there's certification testing. And then we do notice logic and accuracy. It is a public event. I love the question earlier about pre-bunking stuff. My megaphone's not very big. I appreciate y'all having me here today. It's a great platform, but y'all's is so much bigger. And I can advertise as LNA testing, but nobody shows up. And there's a difference in being there to see it when it's happening than for y'all to mention it a few weeks later when they don't like the results. Well, they were testing. They did do this. If y'all can help us get the word out that it's going on before it happens, get folks interested, that would be helpful. And then, of course, we still do other types of testing. The state is now doing what's called parallel monitoring of our elections, which is where they go into a county during active voting and run a test tech through that equipment to be sure it's being counted accurately in the field, and there's a way they can do that without affecting the results. We have additional public confidence that way. And yeah, we also, I think we're maybe one state here that has BMDs for all voters. So we're not just testing the scanners, we're testing the ballot marking devices to be sure they're producing, if you put in candidate A prints out. And then the scanner counts for candidate A. And the server that aggregates the totals for us has that vote for candidate A. And then we send that to the state so they can aggregate everything together at the state level and be sure that vote's still there. So we want to test at all levels, everything involved, every single time, so we're not surprised on election day we're not in the news. We're not in the news for the wrong reasons.
All right, there we go. There we go. That should work. This is basically to whoever wants to answer, or as many of you want to answer. But the first question I had was, you mentioned the public doesn't typically show up for these testing procedures. Do you have the political parties send representatives? Are they there?
So in Arizona, they are invited. It is a public test. It's published in the newspapers, online. And in Arizona, we actually do have people that show up now. We didn't for years, and even in some of our smaller rural counties, they are showing up. So that's good, right? Because the more people that learn about it. But the parties play a really important role in that.
So, yes, in Georgia as well, everyone's invited. If you want to come watch. I can ask my local parties. They always know what's going on. I think we'll have some representation for this election, and I'm very grateful for that. But I think an important point to be made here is our system of elections relies on public participation. And having an observed election, to me, is always better than no one really paying attention to what I do until afterwards. So I hope that in the future we see more folks show up from the parties. But in the past, no matter how much I invite them, they haven't been there.
And my second question is, because we've been talking about pre-bunking, I mean, obviously there were some extraordinary claims made about the voting machinery in the last election, but sort of more on average, if questions do develop that these members of the media might hear after the fact, is there any kind of strain of complaint or type of complaint or question that comes up after the fact about, again, post-results having been received, how the machines operated?
It's interesting, after 2018, the candidate who came up short running for governor said that the machines were flipping the votes. That was the old electronic voting. Then after 2020, we heard the same thing, that the machines, we're flipping votes and not recording accurately. But then after 2022, we didn't hear a peep. No one complained about the equipment.
Yeah. To answer your question specifically, don't wait until after. As soon as the problem is identified, it is incredibly important to be transparent. So we have had some issues in our county with our system from time to time. And as soon as we identified those issues, we got right out in front of it, into the public, identified the issue, talked about what the cause was to the extent we could ascertain it, and then what the solution was. And in the end, when we had our risk limiting audit, and then when we were chosen for the full audit, our votes matched exactly the votes that were cast and counted through the unofficial tally and then through the official tally. So the important point here is do not let mistakes you make go unanswered. I always tell our folks, there's very little we can't fix. If you tell me right away, we can get out in front of it and we can make people understand that we are on top of this. And at the end of the day, we will demonstrate to them in court if we have to, that your vote was counted as it was cast. And in these two instances I'm talking about where we had these difficulties, no candidate challenged the results.
Let me ask a quick question of every state. Are any of your machines hooked up to the internet in any way, shape, manner, or form?
No. Not only are our machines not, but nor is the software and tabulation computer. It's air-gapped from the system. We get criticized for not testing our equipment against cyber attacks. So to the question of what else do we get questioned about, and not understanding that the purpose of logic and accuracy is to ensure that every piece of voting equipment is able to take that paper ballot that is in every one of our counties and is the method by which a voter marks their ballot is to a paper record that is put into a tabulator, and to ensure that those machines are able to tabulate accurately. That is what logic and accuracy is about. And when your machines are not connected to the internet, what am I testing for cyber attacks? There were a lot of accusations after 2020 about IP addresses that have been identified at voting sites and so forth. And it's because we all walk around with these and stand in line and place our order at Chick-fil-A or whatever it might be while we're waiting to vote. That's what those IP addresses were.
No, we are not connected to the internet. Our machines are not connected to the internet, whether they're the tabulators or the electronic poll book on election day in the precincts. Those are also not connected to the internet. Karen, you touched on one thing that I was going to emphasize is we're talking a lot about our logic and accuracy testing, how transparent they are, inviting people out, but I still think the bottom line, the most important part of making sure our election results are accurate and our machines are accurate is paper ballot. Paper, paper, paper.
No, we are not. The scanners, tabulators, the server, same as everybody else, is not hooked up to the internet. I'll tell you what is hooked up to the internet is the election night reporting system. And people mistake that for the voting system because it has results. So a lot of what we're hearing is they see results online and assume that's the voting system itself, but nothing that produces a ballot, that counts a ballot's online, and there's a secure way we transfer the results from that system to an internet-connected system. And I think that's a little bit of nuance that the public may be missing, because they just assume that if it's online, it's online. But what's online is, it's not even the results, it's a copy of the results. And the actual results reside in my office in a secure area that are eventually transferred to the Secretary of State's office in a very secure way. If that ENR system went down, we just post them a different way. So, but I don't think people understand between that and an actual voting system. Anything else?
No, not before, not during, not after, not tabulators for hand-marked paper ballots, not ballot marking devices. In no county is that occurring. And we also, when it comes to reporting results, have the air gap system so that there isn't any kind of pollination between systems when the results are extracted and publicly reported.
No, and we had 5 different independent companies certify this after the 2020 election, so we got to do that a lot. But it doesn't really matter because, you know, that's the point made about paper ballots is even if we had electronic Armageddon, even if we assumed everything was hacked, then we would have an immutable, auditable paper trail to always go back to. And in Arizona, the political parties do a post-election hand count audit of the results to make sure the tabulators weren't inaccurately reading the ballots. But it also brings up another point that, as much as I love Bob, I take issue with the nomenclature voting machines because you know, I think you could argue that Georgia has voting machines in that you are marking your ballot on the ICX on the touch screen, but I prefer the term tabulators because it's just the same type of tabulator that was grading your standardized test when you were high school, and that's hand marked ovals that are filled in, and it just reads those. And so I think sometimes when we say voting machines, it's like this digital device like somehow loads your vote, and it's fair because much of the world does just vote electronically, and there is never a paper copy produced. But this was Chris Krebs' whole thing was giving everyone on paper, and so I think we're at 94% of Americans will have a 98 now. All right, Gabe Sterling, the authority. 98% of Americans have a paper ballot, whether it's marked by digitally, as is done in Georgia, or marked by hand, as it's done in, I think, most of the states.
One nerdy little detail, since you bring up voting machines in Georgia, voting machine is still a term in law in Georgia. Municipalities can still use them. They're the old Shooptronic lever machines with curtains and levers and dials, and I don't know any cities that actually still use them, but they could. And under Georgia law, that's a voting machine. What the state uses for presidential election are not voting machines, you're right.
To turn to a slightly different subject, one of the other charges that came up in past elections is that people who voted early also tried to vote on election day. Could you go over the safeguards in your state that would stop somebody who voted by mail or voted early in person to then turn around and show up on election day? How do you trace it?
It's really simple in that you have to return in every single state. You have to return your early ballot in an assigned envelope. That assigned envelope is assigned to a specific voter profile. As soon as that comes in, it's scanned in such that it loads a vote to that voter profile, such that if you then tried to show up and vote in person, the election administrator at the voting location would say, you know, it appears that you have already returned an early ballot. Do you remember this? And if the person persists or says there must be a mistake, then that person is granted a provisional ballot because we have to do that under federal law. And we can go back and research it, but that provisional ballot will not be moved through until we determine if there was an error or not.
We have, so I think Lisa and Kim could explain exactly, you know, how some of the things happen at the polls and the check-in and check-out of the ballots goes. But in the statewide voter registration database, which all of our local clerks are required to use to track voter registrations, to track if an absentee ballot has been sent, to track when it's been received back at the clerk's office, we use that data from the statewide voter registration database to produce the poll books. So all the clerks are going to print their poll books that go to the polls from the statewide database. And on the poll books, there's actually a watermark on voters' signature block that tells if they've requested or returned an absentee ballot. And so if a voter comes in and they check in and want to vote on election day, but it already shows that they've returned a ballot, then they won't be able to also cast a ballot on election day. If the poll book says that they were sent an absentee ballot but haven't yet returned it, then the poll worker is going to say, have you returned that absentee ballot? And if the voter has, let's say that they forgot and they mailed it that morning and then realized that they weren't going to make it to the polls in time, they're not going to be able to cast their ballot on election day. And unfortunately, their absentee is probably not going to count either. But that's built right into the system and printed right onto the poll books, the status of somebody's absentee ballot.
And I'll only draw a distinction. Most of North Carolina's check-in is electronic. During the early voting period, that means that, as people check in, then it's communicated back to the system, that we've got, someone who's checked in to early vote. On election day, and I'll make this distinction, I think it's really important for the press to realize that when you're an all-mail balloting state, your processes are going to be a little different from one like North Carolina, where the vast majority of our votes are cast in person. So when someone presents themselves to vote at an election day polling place, they have to go to their assigned precinct based upon their voter registration. And so at that precinct, the voters that they're able to check in are the registered voters of that precinct. So if someone does not appear on that poll book, they're going to be offered a provisional ballot, or it's going to be checked in to determine if they're at the right voting location. And so similarly, we have the same information about whether their ballot was already cast by mail or during early voting.
Can we do a bit of a lightning round? And media, we're going to have time for questions in about 15 minutes. So there's two words that haven't come up yet: drop boxes. And if we could kind of go state by state, talking, do you have drop boxes? Does it vary? Some counties do, some counties don't. How are you monitoring those drop boxes? And I'd ask for 35 to 45 seconds.
North Carolina does not have drop boxes other than the mailbox.
Wisconsin, it's up to each municipality to decide whether or not drop boxes is a good option for their community. We have a recent Supreme Court decision that says if a municipality chooses drop boxes, they must be secure. The commission met in an open public session and unanimously passed some guidance, a checklist that allows clerks to kind of analyze their drop box process to make sure it's secure. So in some communities, they have a drop box. A lot of our rural communities, this is super important because they only work 5 hours a week. And so returning your ballot to your clerk might not be possible on most people's schedule.
Hi, I gotta hold it. Hi, Jonathan Brader, Director of Elections in Michigan. We do have drop boxes in every community. It's required in our state constitution that every voter has access to a drop box. They have to be secured to the ground. They have to be video monitored. They have to be emptied every day by clerk staff in the lead up to the election. And there are also specific chain of custody requirements where you're documenting how the drop box is emptied.
All 159 counties have to have drop boxes. It's one for every 100,000 voters. So the larger counties would have more. Bartow County, where Joseph from, haven't hit 100,000 yet, so they have one. Typically, that's the county headquarters, but it has to be under the visual surveillance of an election worker.
And it's worth noting they have to be inside. They're only accessible while the office or advanced voting site's open. And incidentally, I've always been very confused by this conversation considering the sheer number of boxes the U.S. Postal Service has. But we have one right now in Bartow County.
It's really a decision made at the county level in Pennsylvania. Some counties have a lot of them. Some counties have a few of them. Some counties have none of them. Department of State issues guidance related to their physical security, related to 24-hour video surveillance, with the footage retained in case there's an investigation or anything else like that. But it is extraordinary to see the degree to which it's been sort of vilified or whatever else, and the lengths that some counties have gone to where they will be staffed when they're open. The people staffing it will have a camera on them. There'll be a camera on the people who have the camera on them, and 100 other sort of things. And it doesn't, in the end of the day, placate anything, and they still end up in their public meetings with people being upset about drop boxes. They play such an important role in Pennsylvania also when they're offered, because our deadline to apply for mail-in ballot is only 7 days before Election Day. So if you're a voter and you're getting that ballot back Saturday or Monday, and you can't vote on Election Day, it's helpful to have a place where you can return it directly and not put it in the mail.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out the distinction. The state does give us some leeway, but we would call our 10 sites ballot return sites, not a drop box. And so we try to put that message out because In our ballot return sites, as he mentioned, we have 2 staff members there at all time, a police officer outside for any problems, and a video surveillance system that is real time that comes back to our warehouse. And all these ballot return sites have specific hours. You can't just go at 2 in the morning and show up because we need to staff them, and because we staff them, that's the distinction we like to put forth in Allegheny County, that we don't have any drop boxes. We have ballot return sites that are open specific hours and staffed.
We call ours drop boxes. We have 7 of them. They are all in government facilities, and they are all chained to the buildings that they are in, and they are all under 24-hour camera surveillance.
Arizona does have drop boxes. I love the distinction made between postal service boxes because we've used mailboxes forever. People say, oh, drop boxes are bad because you can drop multiple ballots in there in ballot harvesting. Well, you can do that with mailboxes. So it's up to county recorders, and every county in Arizona does utilize drop boxes. They are secured. Many are inside government buildings. Many are under camera surveillance. Fire suppression units in those drop boxes. And voters love the drop boxes. Some of them want to save us money, and it does save money. They've paid for themselves over the years. It also sometimes gets your ballot back quicker to us, and so it's about the voters, all the voters.
Can I just make a quick point on that, too? And I think, Lisa, absolutely great point. You know, the U.S. Postal System, for about 175 years in the state of Michigan, we've used drop boxes called USPS boxes, and there's about 155 of them, 155,000 across the United States. And I think the real point here that I always like to make to our voters is that the method by which you return your ballot is not nearly as important as the methods by which we verify your ballot. So we are using signature verification in the process. Every single ballot is verified and signature verified before it's ever counted. Voters can track their ballots online. In many states, in Michigan, it's michigan.gov/vote. You can see when your clerk has received your ballot. If somebody wants to drop things off in a drop box or a postal box, it doesn't really affect the security and integrity of the process. And I would say, especially as we've gone around talking about it, it sounds like drop boxes are a much more secure way of doing that than post office boxes.
So interrelated, why don't we stick with Michigan? I know that in community conversations, Keep Our Republic Sad across the state, there's been a lot of questions. In-person early voting, can we talk about that, starting with Michigan, but then also folks generally did great sticking to 45 seconds lightning round of if your state has in-person early voting.
Yes, we have in-person early voting in Michigan for at least 9 days in the Constitution.
North Carolina has a 17-day early voting period. County boards of elections do adopt their own plans as to whether they're open on the Saturday and Sunday of the weekends during that period, though all counties are open on the final Saturday until 3 p.m.
So Wisconsin has in-person voting, absentee voting. So I always, we talk about the nomenclature of, we don't have early voting. We have in-person absentee. So you're going to cast your absentee ballot, whether.
Longer than 45 seconds to explain in-person and absentee.
Do I really? So an absentee by mail is one way. So I'm going to make that request. It's going to be mailed to the address where I need to vote, and I'm going to mail that back. Okay. But in person means I'm going to go into my clerk's office, and I'm going to, because I can't be there on election day. Maybe I have a job that's going to take me out of town. Whatever the reason would be, I'm not going to be available to cast my vote in person on election day. So I have the right to make an appointment with my municipal clerk and vote my absentee ballot in person. That
Versus early.
Versus early, yes. I just didn't like the word, because I actually had people show up in our office and say, this municipality doesn't have all the voting tabulators set up. They're not ready for election day. And that was one thing we had to explain is we're not going to have those things for security reasons. It's going to be in-person absentee. But that in-person absentee is issued by the municipal clerk. It's the same process to make that request. You're going to fill out your application that you want that ballot. They're going to initial. They're going to initial that they saw the photo ID that they needed to prove that you are who you say you are and that you are registered to vote. You're going to get your ballot. They're going to mark your ballot, put it in the envelope, and then that clerk is going to witness that they watched that you were the person that cast that ballot. And then that is then secured until election day, where it's brought to the polls. And this is something that I think is very important, is when you're an absentee voter, in absentia, so when you can't be there on election day, we still go up to the poll list and say, Kim Pitleski, 1234 Main Street, you know, and I'm saying that out loud. So if people are watching, they know Kim Pitleski lives in this jurisdiction and has the right to cast a ballot here.
I think we
14
should
days,
point
forgot that
out,
part.
so even that is possibly different than how absentee ballot voting is conducted in different states. We've touched on listing an excuse. Many states are no excuse absentee voting. That's North Carolina. You can't be present. You choose to vote by mail, or you choose to vote in-person early voting. We don't ask you why. You're just provided a ballot. We go through some of the same processes, but I just would make that distinction that you're going to find differences in what absentee voting is and what no excuse or an excuse required is.
So, but in Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Arizona, in-person early voting.
We have minimum of 17 days early voting. That's 3 weeks, 2 Saturdays, optional for 2 Sundays. Any county can elect that. And 60 to 65% of all Georgians vote early.
In Pennsylvania, I won't need the full 45 seconds because we have a system very similar to Wisconsin, where the voter has the ability to show up at a Board of Elections office in person, request a mail-in ballot. If approved, complete it and return it all in one spot. Many of our counties have opened satellite Board of Elections offices to make that process more accessible to voters. So we don't have technically early voting, but we do have the in-person ballot on demand voting in Pennsylvania. So I can return the remaining 10 seconds of my time.
Arizona's had no excuse early voting since 1992. It currently constitutes about 80 to 85% of our vote will come back through an early ballot. We are not, however, like most of our neighboring western states like Nevada, Utah, Oregon, California, Washington. We are not an all-mail state, so you must still make a request or be on what we call the active early voting list.
I'm not sure if somebody's, I just wanted to jump in about a clarification on some terms. So how we think about in-person absentee is that you don't put your absentee through a tabulator when you voted in the clerk's office. You put it in an envelope, and it goes to the polling place to be opened and counted on election day. Whereas typically early voting, the definition of that is you've got the tabulators set up at the in-person absentee site, and you're actually feeding the early ballot through the tabulator. So just wanted to make that clarification.
But then if you really want to get into the weeds,
Yeah.
we do put them in the tabulator during our early voting period in North Carolina, but they have a retrievable ballot number. And so it does not identify who the voter is, but if we need to access that ballot because of some of the other reasons we were talking about earlier with death or felony conviction or being an ineligible voter, then we can retrieve it by North Carolina law. So I believe it's just North Carolina and Louisiana that have that, but I could stand corrected on it.
That's true, at least in our case. You know, again, getting into the weeds. In Georgia, if you are eligible when you cast your ballot, we count that ballot. And, you know, terminology in Georgia, we call it advanced voting rather than early voting. There used to be a different term for early voting and advanced voting just with excuses. I encourage y'all, as you're reporting on different states, to make sure we're using the right words for that state and identifying that that's unique to that state, and your state might have a different term for that.
Okay, I heard a reference to Louisiana. As they say in Louisiana, was le bon temps parler, let the good times roll. Press, any and all questions are welcome for the next 25, 30 minutes. And I think my colleague Steve has a mic, a wireless mic for Aaron, but once again, if you could just introduce yourself and your outlet.
Aaron Mansfield, USA Today. Just to follow up on the early voting, which of your states have fewer opportunities to vote early in 2024 than maybe you did in 2020? Some places have shortened their windows for early voting.
By 1 day.
And standardized it statewide.
Yeah, we're expanding faster than the universe in terms of opportunities to vote before election day. So early voting, this is our first in-person early voting opportunity for a November election. So So that in addition to also we have permanent vote by mail as well.
North Carolina's relatively remained the same, including the number of sites, and I guess maybe that's another distinction in North Carolina is that county boards of elections the early voting is not just at their county board of elections. They can have multiple sites. Mecklenburg County, for example, where Charlotte is, has over 30 sites. Wake County, where our state capital is, I believe they're at 25 sites. So we've relatively remained the same. And we have that volume of opportunity because 60 to 65% of the votes cast in North Carolina are generally during the in-person early voting period.
We had a decades-long litigation in Wisconsin, truly, where the law says that in the 2 weeks before an election, you can do in-person absentee. And then throughout this litigation for probably 8 years, that was ruled not to be correct, and that every municipal clerk got to decide how long they had absentee. So in some places, as soon as ballots were ready, it could be 50, 55 days before the election, they could start in-person absentee. Now we have a final court ruling where they said it reverts back to what the statute says. So we're back to 2 weeks before the election, you can do in-person absentee.
If you want to see the list of when all the states have their deadlines, the National Conference of State Legislatures, ncsl.org, has a terrific list. It's worth noting that all these battleground states have longer periods for that voting than New York, Maryland, Delaware, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. So these tend to be regional more than anything else, but there are lots of opportunities in these states.
Hi, guys. This is Miles Parks with NPR. I was hoping you guys could speak to how you're communicating to voters about voting early. I know I've heard from a number of election administrators that are really pushing voters to use early voting or mail voting to not really crowd the polling place on Tuesday, but in some places it's a little bit more polarized. Early voting is a little bit more polarized right now than maybe it used to be, and I guess I wonder how you guys are thinking about that in terms of communicating to voters about which voting method to use to potentially kind of ease some of the load on your local administrators?
Well, I would just say I don't push any voting method on our voters. I make sure that they are educated and aware of the opportunities they have, whether it's early and in-person, election day in the precinct, or no reason absentee voting. It's not my business to care how they cast their ballot, as long as they're doing it securely and using the method that works best for them to be able to make their voice heard and cast their ballot.
I think that's the same in Arizona. It's not up to us, it's up to the voter. And I think the message that we all need to promote is to make a plan. However that works for you, make a plan. In many states, of course, the turnout in a presidential year is 3 times what it is in a normal election. We had the presidential preference in the primary in Arizona, 40% turnout. This could be 80. So there would be ballot measures, lots of ballot measures on different ballots across the U.S. Those are very complicated. So whether a voter chooses to vote in person and read all those and decide how they vote, or they do their sample ballot, which everybody gets a sample ballot in Arizona if you're not on the active early voting list, please encourage people to fill out that sample ballot, bring it with them on election day. Otherwise, it's going to be very complicated, and that does create lines.
I disagree.
You, Steve?
Yeah, we are tired in Arizona of hearing about results, and so we have included a new leaflet in all early ballot packets. We have done a lot of messaging, trying to help people understand that if they want to have 100% of results on election day, they need to get their early ballots back early. And so in my ideal world, everyone would vote within the first 3 days of getting their early ballot. And
like you and I do.
Like you, we do.
Agree on
yes,
that, 'cause
yeah.
we do that. Steve and I have been long time vote by mail early.
Miles, I'll say, I mean, we do encourage people to consider early voting in North Carolina. We do message it very similarly. Plan your vote. And so, the popularity of voting by mail has increased, and people realize that sometimes their choice is to vote in their pajamas from the comfort of their home. And so we point that out, that that's an advantage. We know there are traditionalists who are always going to vote on election day, and certainly we try to explain that process. But I think the popularity of early voting in North Carolina, that 17-day period, is largely because North Carolinians have realized, and we try to inform them of this, the convenience of being able to vote at any early voting site in their county, not having to go to their precinct-specific polling place on election day, the ability to vote when it's 70 degrees and sunny, and make it an event where you gather your friends and then you go out to brunch is a lot easier said and done than trying to make it there on election day, not knowing if there's going to be a tropical cyclone like we've just experienced in North Carolina, or a hurricane like we have seen at times. You don't know what election day is going to hold, and if you're not in line at 7:30, we can't ensure that you have to be in line at 7:30 p.m. on election day in order to make your voice heard. You've got a 17-day period if you early vote, and if the weather is not cooperative or a traffic accident happens, you can come back on Thursday if Saturday didn't work out. So that's what we do encourage, is try to express the benefits, and just as Lisa said, it's so important for voters to plan their vote, to know where they can go vote, to know that their voter registration is current, and that information is right, to look at sample ballots in advance so that it can be a smoother process in marking their ballot. So whatever their voting method of choice, planning their vote is really the most important message.
Seeing another hand over here. I don't know where the mic is. That's still with our friend from NPR.
Thank you for doing this. Yvonne Winget Sanchez, reporter for The Post based in Arizona. I'm curious what you guys might be doing differently and additionally this cycle compared to what you might have been doing in 2022 or 2020 when it comes to resources for the health and well-being, the mental health, et cetera, maybe the physical safety of not just permanent election workers, but volunteers as well.
We have made this very much a focus. We have had extensive de-escalation training for our election officials, training that is offered to the county election officials who work day in and day out, but that they can provide to their election day workers or voting site workers. We have had training offered through the elections group on wellness and resiliency. We have had sessions with a doctor through the Department of Defense who understands that many election officials are experiencing PTSD. And so he was part of one of our conferences, and we plan to have him back before Election Day to talk about, triggers that you did not anticipate, being back in that circumstance again, and how it might cause you to react. And then just trying to have field support and resources, make ourselves available so that we really can lock arms and know that we've got this, and that we are professionals, and we call ourselves Team 101, 100 county boards of elections and 1 state board of elections working in unison to deliver voting in North Carolina.
I think, Lamont, I saw you at a...
So one of the concerns that has been permeating is that elections are soft targets, if you will. So in our county, we've been working with various agencies of the federal government to review our cybersecurity, to review our physical security surrounding elections, and receiving recommendations from them. And I won't describe the specific recommendations we got or the things we are doing to harden our elections processes to protect folks and to protect the process itself. But we are actually doing that, and we're spending money that the legislature has in their wisdom after the passage of Act 77 in Pennsylvania to supply counties with more money to put elections on. One of the things we can do with that money is harden our elections, and that's what we're doing in our county.
Just very briefly, two quick things. One, since last year, the Shapiro administration organized an election threat task force with federal, state, and local partners. So should any of the ugliness that our election workers that they experienced in 2020 return, everyone knows what everybody else's responsibilities are, and law enforcement can do its job so our election workers can focus on their job that only they can do. In addition, we've created a training unit, which is pretty new as of last year because of the terrific turnover of election workers in Pennsylvania and across the country, led by an experienced county election director to train newer election directors so they know what to do in preparation for a smooth election.
So in Georgia, I mean, from the state level, we've had more communications about threats in the threat landscape. And they've partnered with so many different agencies, can't even count them, to get the word out about mental health, about physical safety, about anything else that we need to know about. My association is stepping up to support each other and make sure that our members have the resources they need to, even if that's just a friendly person to talk to, whenever you need it, to get through this year as things heat up. In my county, I have new training for my staff on physical threats, on mental health. As you said, I can go over the details of what that security training is, but I'll say that it prioritizes people. The people that are there working, the people that are there volunteering as poll watchers, the voters, whatever the threat is, whether it's a very angry person or a natural disaster, it's the people that are important here. And the last thing I wanted to mention is this is a community. One of the things I love about working elections is the community. That we're here today, all these different states talking about these important issues, and other groups out there. I see somebody here from Elections Group who has prioritized mental health training and offered additional resources to our election officials. I'm just so grateful that we're having this conversation because it is so, so important.
So I think we have time for two more questions that.
All right, can I just jump in here? I'm sorry, I don't think you can see me from here, but I'm yeah, just quickly, I in agreements with all my colleagues on this thing. I think one of the things we've really talked a lot about on our team is resilience and what that looks like. In addition to a lot of the resources the state's provided, tabletop exercises and discussions, mental health is a huge part of that. And I think something that I don't want to get lost in this discussion is the fact that, we signed up to do this for a reason, and there's joy in this process. We are a part of this incredible long history, right, of allowing people to engage in the democratic process and choose their government. And I think, as I talk to my own team, we're encouraging one another with a lot of stories. We tend to focus sometimes on the challenges and some of the negatives, but I think we have so many positive stories, so many first-time voters and walking into precincts and getting high fives and cheers from election workers when they vote. We go out into communities, and I'm talking to a fourth grade class next week, and we're doing a mock election with Oreos. We're using, taste testing the Oreo and voting for your favorite Oreo. And these kids are coming up and asking legitimate questions that some adults are not asking about voting. So, all of these things, I think, are so important to remind ourselves of, and it's a part of that resilience that Karen and Joseph and others have been talking about. We have to remember why we're in this game. It's actually not for the money. I don't know about you guys. It's because we really are doing something meaningful, and that is felt by all of us, and I think that's something that we can't forget as a part of mental health.
Those are really great points. And I was just going to say, from Wisconsin's perspective, I know I've talked a lot about how small our jurisdictions are, but these are incredibly small places. Imagine your grandma in small town, rural area, decides she wants to serve her community and step up and be a clerk. And she gets paid for 5 hours a week, but probably works at least 40, right, running the election. So all of our clerks have really inspired me. They're incredible because as we've navigated this process in this new landscape where, threats and harassment are kind of a part of the landscape, they've shown that we're not going to let fear rule us. We're not going to let bullies or harassment dictate how we operate, that we are stronger than that. We are more resilient than that, and we're going to keep doing our job the way that we've always done it, with integrity in mind. And so our focus has really been on empowering them as they navigate that, right? Because they're going to charge forward, and so we want to make sure that they're building those relationships with their law enforcement, that they have things like security assessments of their offices and their polling places so that they can go to work knowing that they're going to be safe, and that they can continue to stand up against the threats and harassment that they might be facing.
Thank you all for doing this. Namdi Agwanwu with NBC News. My question was for Secretary Raffensperger. I was hoping to ask you about a letter you wrote to the Georgia Election Board earlier this week, urging them to pause any rulemaking this close to the election. I was hoping you could expand on what risk you view additional rulemaking would propose and whether or not you think they have the legal authority at this stage of the election cycle to continue making rules.
One of the questions would really go to a legal determination, but I do, and I've mentioned to the State Election Board several times that there's a ruling out there years ago, the Purcell ruling, which really said 90 days before an election, you should not institute major changes to the election process. And we consider these major changes to the election process. I guess we have several concerns. Number one is the actual, counting of the number of ballots that you have at the precinct. That's going to take time. Everything that we've done for the last 6 years has to speed up the process to give the voters the results quicker. And all of a sudden now, they're adding an element that is actually going to take longer. See, we are going to have 65 to 70% of all results reported by 8 p.m. When you start breaking open the ballot boxes, all of a sudden, the 30 to 35%, that's not going to happen by 12 o'clock at night. It could be 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. But then it also adds the element of our concern about breaking of the chain of custody. When you bring all of those ballot boxes back to, say, Joseph's county election headquarters, the ballots sit there, but then he'll have the staff in place, you'll have the procedures in place, both political parties and outside observers. When you do it at the precinct that night with 2,400 precincts throughout the entire state of Georgia, it's something that I don't actually think can happen, and that's our concern. I think if people thought more like a business person, like I do because I've been in business, we always had in my business a lot of moving parts. And what you want to have is as few moving parts as possible, because the more moving parts you have, the more chance you have for error. It's a lot easier to run a small business than a big business. Big business is complicated. 2,400 precincts is very complicated with 5 million pieces of paper, 5 million ballots. So we've been very clear on this, and we will see what the State Election Board does with their meeting tomorrow.
Thank you. Laura Barone-Lopez with PBS NewsHour. Each of you talked a bit about building resiliency, taking preparations to protect election workers. But do you think that there will be violence in your state on or post-election day? And if not, what do you consider the single biggest threat to being able to do your job?
I would just point out that after the snack break, we're going to be devoting a lot of time to that. I was just going to say that I was aware of that. So, colleagues, it's a serious topic, but to be respectful, let's do a quick go round.
We don't know, but our jobs as election officials, be it violence, be it natural disaster, be it whatever, is to be prepared for what we don't know. And that's how we're approaching it. So, if it's training on how to deal with hazardous materials, if it's training on how to de-escalate a difficult situation, if it's posters that tell you how to dial 911 and who else you need to contact in a state of emergency, then that's what we're doing. But it's in line with what we do as election professionals, is to be prepared for whatever comes at us, and that's what we're doing. I hope that what we've managed to do is instill enough confidence in the electorate that we are election professionals, and our job, whether we agree with you personally or not, our job is to ensure that every eligible voter is able to cast their ballot, and that's what we're going to do. And unfortunately, we've seen that there may be disruptions following Election Day, and we will prepare for that. But, hopefully, we're returning to a world of civility where we understand that, there are winners and losers in every contest, be it a sporting event or an electoral contest, and that at the end of the day, there will be a winner and there will be a loser, and that has to be accepted.
So someone asks me what's going to happen at the next election. It'll be something completely different from the last one. We build contingency plans for everything we do. We train for those. If we have to turn on a dime, we can. Election officials are really good at pivoting and going another way. It's hard to say what's going to happen. It's because it's always different.
So certainly the vast majority of folks involved in the election process are peaceful. Of course, we have to be prepared, and that's why we have emphasized, as of other states, a lot more physical security in our planning. We've also, as of other states, brought in law enforcement much earlier in the process in terms of our security planning, and a lot of those have been discussions at the local level, which is really helpful. I think law enforcement, whether they like it or not, have become much more expert in a lot of the election processes. So that's going to help us be in a better position to be prepared. But more broadly, I think the big concern is just the continued misinformation, malinformation, false information that's being spread about our elections. That's a problem that threatens the integrity of the election system, regardless of whether we have violence or not.
In Georgia, we've had regional security roundtables, bringing in local sheriffs, both federal and state resources on law enforcement. We will probably have deputies outside the precinct just to add that element. We've also partnered with Vet the Vote. We think the more veterans we have that'll have their T-shirts, it's the most highly respected group of folks. If you served in the military before, wear your ball cap. Let us know when you served, what you served. But we think that also adds, just a sense of, you can trust these folks. They're making sure we have fair and honest elections. And then we've also done, scenario training with our election workers so they could actually see what are some of the issues that we could be facing. We understand it's a serious issue. We want to make sure everyone knows that it's going to be a safe environment, but we also will have lanyards with press a button, so that goes to law enforcement. And then we also have a texting tool, a see something, say something. We want to make sure it stays safe and secure. But after 2020, even in Joseph's County, he had some of his poll workers that were followed home, and this is an 80-20 county. It just didn't make any sense. But we can talk to that if you'd like further.
Very briefly, they weren't followed home. They were followed back with the ballots. They almost ran off the road. It was terrifying. To follow up on one thing the Secretary said, in Georgia, there is a duty on the sheriffs to staff the polls with deputies. And every community can do so. It's been a community-by-community decision. For example, in my county, not every poll has law enforcement there. If they're there, they may not be visible. But I do trust, especially knowing my sheriff, that they'll be there when we need them. So to get back to your original question, do I expect violence? I sure hope not. There's no room for that in elections, but if anything happens, we're going to be ready for it.
I think earlier I talked about being prepared, and we will be, but I know in my county, my folks aren't going to be violent on Election Day, and I know our fellow Pennsylvanians they're going to approach this as peacefully as they always have.
I think just to pick up one very quick thing that Michigan just raised is the relationship between the avalanche of mis and disinformation we're seeing and people who might very well be decent people who are consuming it all and then acting out in a way that must seem reasonable to them. So when things were being said about Philadelphia in 2020, there were people from other states who put guns in their car and drove to our tabulation center because of all the misinformation that they had been exposed to and acting out in a way that puts people in danger. That's why we organized the Election Threat Task Force, and it keeps an eye on those sort of things and taking some other steps as well.
So I think the recorder and I can probably both have some thoughts about this, and we probably agree on this topic because it's very sensitive to everybody in this room. We're pretty resilient, but I'll tell you what, poll workers are resilient because many of them have been doing this for decades. And even in the COVID times, at least in the county I was in, we lost very few poll workers because they're like, look, the election has to go on. So of course, we're concerned about violence. I'm more concerned after election and that week up. Remember, because we talked about election ballots aren't going to be tabulated right away. It takes time to verify these things. So I think that's important. We've also done a lot of tabletop exercises since 2020, but we really ramped it up this year. So we did media tabletops, we did law enforcement tabletops. So they really are way more expert in election law than they want to be.